This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from the city of Cleveland in the state of Ohio in the United States of America, the city of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the home of Superman, and the world-renowned Cleveland Orchestra. He is an American Protestant clergyman, an author, and a theologian who served as the 9th General Minister and Global President of the United Church of Christ between June 2015 and July 2023. He has a passion for delivering justice through the power of love. He received the Eden Seminary Shalom Award for his commitment to peace and justice. And in 2017, the Center for American Progress named him as one of the progressive religious leaders to follow. He has a BA in philosophy, a master's in divinity, and a doctorate in ministry, where he studied the effects of white privilege on the church. He is also the author of 3 books named Steeplejacking, Beyond Resistance, and Into the Mystic. Stay tuned as he shares with us his simple yet profound definition of religion, of spirituality, and explains why he thinks traditional churches are in steady decline. How a Christian denomination church partnered with a Greek Orthodox church to serve 2.5 Muslim refugees in Jordan after being displaced from Syria, and why Nelson Mandela's gift to humanity is essential today in the USA and worldwide. We warmly welcome Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So, John, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. You've played such a significant role in the world of the church in the United States and around the world, and I feel truly blessed that you're coming to have this conversation and joining this global movement for change.
Well, Anne, let me thank you. It is a delight, an honor, and a pleasure to be counted among those that you are speaking with. And I've seen the list of leaders from around the world that you've talked to, and to even be thought of in their company is a great honor to me. And I love the work that you're doing, trying to deeply instantiate the world and its leaders with notions that Nelson Mandela built. And I'm really proud of what you're doing and honored to be a part of this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would love to begin with what attracted you to the church. And perhaps you could share a little bit about your background as well. I know you were born and raised as a Catholic, one of 7 children, born in Ohio, moved to St. Louis when you were 3 years of age, and raised a Catholic, but then made a transition. So my question is, within the context of some of the forces that shaped your life, what drew you to the church and what drew you to this current position?
So to be perfectly honest, I don't know that I was drawn to the church. I was born into it. Then, like a fish in water, it becomes a part of the surroundings that you don't feel like you really choose. However, as I matured, I had many opportunities to walk away from the church if I wanted to. I stayed not because I appreciate so much the institutional power that it wields, as I do when at its best it engages in the kind of ministry and mission and practice of love that has the capacity to bring good to the world. And from that perspective, the church for me in its Christian articulation is a pathway towards kindness and compassion when practiced at its best. I don't argue that the church is the pathway, or even the best pathway. It is
Yeah.
simply a pathway, and it happens to be the one of my choosing. So I was raised Catholic, and
Hmm.
at a young age felt what I thought was a clear and unmistakable call to the priesthood. And for quite a few years, every decision I made, including turning down a soccer scholarship at the number one ranked university in the country, was in obedience to what I heard as that call to the priesthood. And I
Yeah.
spent 8 years in seminary preparing for the priesthood, and was accomplished enough as a student that I was invited to finish my studies in Rome. And I knew what that meant. And that was an offer you don't say no to, but I said no
Yeah.
to it. And I was just beginning to wrestle with some big things. And the best way to describe that is through those 8 years, from day one, I found myself pressing questions that I needed to resolve, knowing that when I took a vow of obedience to the bishop, that
Yeah.
vow of obedience would require me to compel members of my parishes to believe the teachings of the church given to me by the bishop.
Yeah.
So I kept pressing for questions. Why can't women be ordained? What exactly do we mean when we say there is no salvation outside the church? Why do we practice exclusive communion rituals? What about celibacy is required in order for me to live out my calling as a priest? And I wasn't willing to argue about them being right, me being wrong, them being right. I simply wanted to know what you're
Yeah.
thinking behind this. Make it make sense to me, because I'm not
Yeah.
sure I understand it. And the response was invariably something like, John, these are the teachings of the church. They have been the teachings for 2,000 years, and who are you to question them?
Wow.
And for a long time, I just disappointed, but I just put up with that. And then it dawned on me, if I couldn't get to a place of intellectual reconciliation with this, I was
Yeah.
not about to take a vow of obedience to the bishop that would compel me to force others to believe things that I didn't yet know I believed. And I knew there was something wrong with me, not the church, and that eventually I would get it, and then I could, with integrity and good faith, take that vow. So heartbreakingly, I walked away from what I was sure was my calling, and then scratched my head wondering what somebody with a degree in Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy now does if they're not going on to the priesthood. And as fate would have it, I met a woman a week after those 8 years,
Yeah.
only because she was the maid of honor in my brother's wedding.
Yes.
And her claim is she fell in love with me at the wedding when I read 1 Corinthians 13 as a part of the ceremony. Um, and we don't need to go through all of the circumstances, but within a short while, I was going out on dates with her,
Yeah.
still believing that my pathway was somehow um, ministry in the Catholic Church. I toyed with joining a monastery, talked with a group of Marianists about going to China and
Mhm.
doing missionary work in a monastery in China.
Yeah.
And I had about a 2-month window if I were going to do that before I would leave, study Chinese culture and language in New York for 3 months, and then spend the rest of my life as a missionary in China. Meanwhile, falling more madly and deeply in love with this woman who happened to be Lutheran. And I went to my spiritual director, I went to my friends, they all said the same thing. You're going to throw away what you know is your vocation for a woman you just met after 8 years in a celibate all male environment? That makes no sense. Well,
Yeah.
it didn't make any sense, except my heart wouldn't let me say no. She was Lutheran. I ended up making a decision by the end of that summer to continue in a relationship with her, and within the year we were married and have been married for 39 years. And then a funny thing happened a year into our marriage. I was
Yeah.
still struggling to find out what I'm supposed to do. I taught for a year. I worked with a painting contractor for a year. And then one day I'm cooking dinner in our kitchen for her family. Her mom was there, her brother was there, their kids were there.
And you're talking about Mimi, your wife, right?
Mimi, my wife, yeah, her family.
Yeah.
And her brother, John, walked into the kitchen where I was cooking, and with no polite conversation to introduce this, just walked in, looked me in my face, and said, "Just because you're no longer Catholic doesn't mean you're no longer called." I'd begun worshiping in her Lutheran church. The minute he said it, whatever I felt as a child that led me to believe I was called into ministry was, rekindled in that moment. And
Oh,
I felt both a sense of obligation to fulfill that call and joy that I had options that, for whatever reason, I hadn't seriously considered. And I
in-
remember going to bed that night with Mimi after
yeah.
they had all left and telling her what he said and saying, "I'm wondering what you would feel about me going back into the seminary." And she celebrated that. I think she knew that was my calling.
Yeah.
And we were living in St. Louis at the time. She was pregnant with our first child. We didn't want to uproot our family at that point with the support that we had from our respective families. And the only seminary that was compatible with this evolving theology that I had was Eden Seminary, which belonged to a church called the United Church of Christ. I'd never heard of it, didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember walking into the dean of students in my overalls at the end of a long day with a painting contractor, covered in paint and sweat and smelly,
Yeah.
and saying, "I'd like to explore a conversation with you." I told him I had spent 8 years in a Catholic seminary, and his first words to me were, "John, if you come here, you're going to have to learn to question everything." And I thought, where have you been all my life?
Yeah.
And having been raised Catholic, having now entered as a Lutheran, our both Mimi and I, our discovery of the United Church of Christ led us to believe that this was the church of our heart. It's a denomination that teaches that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here.
Yeah.
That's the church I had been longing for, and that's the church I've now spent 35 years in ministry with and remain dedicated to because of its capacity to bring love into the world.
Yeah. And that's a powerful statement. And I think to that point, what's also struck me, John, and we've touched on this previously, is this um, trending downwards of people feeling confident and comfortable going to church. The fact that church attendance is on the demise and churches are closing.
Mhm.
In your view, two things. What is your definition of religion?
Yeah.
And why do you think this trend is happening and accelerating?
So here's my simple definition of religion. And I have come to identify myself as a theological minimalist.
Hmm.
I only now hold two things that I will defend to be theologically true,
Yeah.
other than the belief that there is a God. About that God, I only postulate two things: God is love, and God is just. And love without justice makes no sense to the eyes of the God that I have come to know and enter into
Yeah.
relationship with.
Yeah.
And love without justice is mere sentimentality, and justice without love is mere self righteous anger. And I don't think either has the capacity to change hearts. But together, it is the force that can change the world. And that's what religion is. Religion is anti any enterprise or any effort that has the capacity to engender kindness and compassion towards another. period.
Hmm.
And why religion is failing, the enterprise of religion is failing. I think there are two dynamics. There are multiple dynamics going on, but there are two things. And I write about this in my second book, which is a
Yeah.
reflection on the institutional church meeting the postmodern world. The church as I know it in its current 21st century Western articulation is more interested in the preservation of its institutional identity than it is the propagation of a mission calling people to love, compassion, and kindness. And when I talk about a church being fed by the movement of a Holy Spirit, I see any institution more interested in its preservation is being abandoned by the Spirit, who has no use for it anymore. And without that, it will die. And whether that dying is a result of the abandonment of Holy Spirit, not interested in watching institutions perpetuate themselves, or merely the product of postmoderns who see institutions as irrelevant, is a difference without a distinction. Nobody wants to spend their life helping an institution preserve its identity.
Yeah.
And to the extent that we do that, nobody's interested in it.
Sure.
The second thing, and this is a bit more mechanical and technical, at least in the United States, we refer to the time after the Second World War as the baby boomer generation.
Yeah.
And there were two things going on at the same time. There was the expansion of the American household and the boom of babies born after the Second World War. You couldn't build schools fast enough. You couldn't build suburbs and neighborhoods fast enough, and you couldn't build churches fast enough. But there
Yeah.
was also, it was the last generation that would feel a deep loyalty to the institution. But then after the Second World War and the dropping of two atomic bombs and the Vietnam War and Watergate and the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
generations of leaders lost their faith in the institution as an instrument of change. It became an institution of perpetuating the status quo.
Yeah.
And so after the baby boomers left church and stopped having or had fewer children, that expansion that took place in the 50s saw us with a glut of churches that we just no longer need. And of course, they were going to close. Add to that the attachment that church has with institution and now a third generation that is not loyal to institution, but in fact is working to deconstruct the power built by institutions. And you have what we see today. None of which, by the way, says anything about whether or not current generations have a spiritual hunger. I believe they do. And a capacity to do good to the other. I believe they do.
John, I just want to pause you there because I think that's such a profound statement. And, another burning question I have for you is, this distinction between, and I have a number of friends who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Spiritual.
And so to that end, and, just taking your current observation around this new generation who truly are seen as, a positive force in the world, a positive force for change. How would you define spirituality vis-a-vis your definition of religion?
Spirituality is a pathway to the sacred, however you articulate that,
Mm-hmm.
however you define your relationship with the sacred or the holy. And spirituality is that pathway that gives you access to your sacred. And for some, it's a quiet walk beside a mountain stream. For some, it's standing in the spires of a Gothic cathedral with light streaming in through the stained glass windows and just feeling a deep connection to something bigger than you and beyond you. For some, it's, as we are wont to say in our Christian tradition, being gathered with two or three, where two or three are gathered, I will be there in your midst. And quietly sharing stories about your journey and what you've encountered along the way, and quietly praying with, to, or for one another. There are a
Yeah.
myriad of pathways. And what we're discovering about current emerging generations is they see a multiplicity of pathways as something beautiful, and they're not going to be what I refer to as monogamous worshipers. They're not going to extend their spiritual loyalty to a single institutional articulation of spirituality. They're
Yeah.
going to sample the menu of opportunities, the rich array of opportunities that are available to them.
Sure.
So they'll be
Sure.
Buddhist, and they'll be yogic, and they'll be Kabbalist Jewish, and they'll be Catholic and deeply traditional and New Age and all of that. And they'll
Yeah.
experiment with it and ask just a couple of questions of the experience. One, can I connect with my sacred? Two, will they take seriously the life experiences that I bring into the connection, and not just send an expert to me who has all of the answers?
Yeah.
And three, will they engage me in my life's work and energy in actions that make a positive difference in the world? I think those are the questions they're asking.
And I would love you just to also, for the benefit of our audience, to define what you mean by sacred. So when you reference about bring me to my sacred place, or what is your definition of that? And well, let's start there. And before I ask, yeah,
Yeah, this is the hardest question to answer. And typically we want to anthropomorphize this, right? God is a man, or uh, moving a little bit beyond gender, God is woman, mother, father. We want to anthropomorphize that, and that's appropriate only as long as we understand that as the response of the poet among us, the artist among us, who's looking for metaphor to try and attach meaning to something we have no language for.
yeah,
I say it this way: it's whatever inspires in you a sense of awe and wonder, a sense of mystery, a sense of, at one and the same time, connecting you to something so far beyond yourself that you can't imagine it, while at the same time feeling intimately connected to it and others through it. I have no language for it. I don't imagine it to be an individual or an entity. Um, I, I don't even know how to describe it. I only know that when I find myself in its presence, I am
yeah.
deeply moved, and I am aware that there is something beyond my capacity to understand. I get the inclination to worship it, though I don't know that whatever it is, it's interested in that. Other than, I think, just the simple standing in awe and wonder. That to
And
me
when
is what is sacred.
and when you say
Yeah.
deeply moved in what way? What are those
See, I
feelings?
don't want
What?
to give definition of that. I've always
Yeah,
said that
yeah,
worship, and that's language that we use in our Christian tradition, and others use it,
yeah,
nothing more than a coming together in ways that have the potential to connect you to the sacred. And that connection to the sacred, when authentic, is always going to produce a response in you. It may
yeah,
be awe, it may be wonder, it may be fear,
yeah,
it
yeah,
may be motivation, it may be inspiration.
yeah.
But both the encounter must be authentic and not manufactured, as well as the response. You can't manufacture a response.
Sure.
And my experience is that in these authentic encounters with the sacred, anything is possible. I've been in a room where people stand up and dance and shout
Yeah,
and exclaim. I've been in a room where people are moved to deep internal solitude just to reflect quietly on what they've experienced and what it means. I've been in the room when people are just moved to tears and don't even know they're crying. All of those are authentic, and you can't prescribe them, you can't manufacture them, you can't require them. They are what they are. And
Yeah.
I don't want to try and define it
No,
or
I,
limit
I
it.
think I think you've encapsulated wonderful examples of how people can and do experience that. It kind of leads me into a different question around some of the awe and wonder that you've been creating in the world with UCC, United Church of Christ, and the work you've been doing abroad. Can you share with us a particular example? And I'm struck by the very moving example you did reference when we spoke previously about the work you have done with the Greek Orthodox Church in Jordan and resettling 2 million refugees from Syria. Uh, could you take us back to that moment?
Yeah,
What was the context, the event? What did you experience? And is this an example of awe and wonder in the work
yeah.
of you, the church, and multiple churches coming together to deal with a very real human crisis?
So this is a story about a Christian denomination partnering with the Greek Orthodox Agency and servicing a Muslim refugee community in Jordan, all of which have agency in the unfolding of the story that I'm about to tell. And the interconnectedness of a world that can organize itself around compassion and kindness and love. The United Church of Christ is one of 64 what we call united and uniting communions that were built within their contexts, usually their countries, uh, as a coalition of the willing. And what I mean by that, any pre-existing denominations that wanted to lose their previous historical identity and merge with others to form a united body became a part of the united and uniting worldwide movement. And we're one of 64, the United Church of Christ here in the US context. But we have relationships in mission partnership with over 90 countries around the world. And in those places, we don't show up in the typical model of a missionary looking to proselytize and convert and convince the quote heathens and barbarians unquote that only Christ can save them from their wicked ways.
Yeah.
We now practice what we call an accompaniment model of
Mhm.
presence,
Can
where
you find that for us?
it comes out of the liberation theology context that uh, emerged largely in the 1970s and later in Latin America, in Southern Asia, and in other places. And it sees God's primary action in the human community as an agent of liberation, freeing people from their oppressors so they can live what we call in our constitutional American language, their pursuit of happiness,
Yeah.
unimpeded by the influence of oppressors. And so we try to look around the world in places where oppression and injustice are rampant and be present to accompany those unjustly treated on their journey, not to rescue them, not to be their saviors, not to
Yeah.
walk in with a previously articulated pathway to justice that makes sense to us, but simply to say, we are here to accompany you on your journey. Here
Yeah.
are resources that we bring with us. Are you able to use them in ways that could be meaningful in your struggle for justice and freedom
Yeah.
from oppression and tyranny?
Mhm.
And in one such instance, we work with a non-governmental organization in Jordan, run by the Greek Orthodox Church there, and in particular, a woman by the name of Wafa Gusus, Greek Orthodox. Jordan is a country that is a what we would call a developing third world country,
Yeah.
very poor.
Yeah.
Its geography is almost all desert. And yet, with only 6 million occupants, they currently house and welcome and support about 2.5 million Syrian refugees,
That's
which
remarkable.
embarrasses the country in which I live, the largest, wealthiest nation on earth, that during the Trump presidency reduced its recipient of refugees from around the world to 10,000. 10,000. So one of those communities of refugees is a tent village of about 250 families, about a kilometer from the Syrian border. And 2 or 3 times a week, Wafa takes truckloads of goods to that community in order to support them. One of the most poignant and maybe one of the saddest and yet beautiful commentaries that I had when visiting there was a father who said, as I looked around at this village, this tent village in the desert where they have to walk 6 miles to a grocery store with the $20 a week they get from the UN, this father telling me that his child sleeps more comfortably and quietly and safely in that tent than he did in their home in Syria. That the conditions were so bad that they had to flee, and this was their better option, and their children sleep peaceably in those tent villages. That's both poignant and beautiful and sad at the same time.
Yes, it is indeed. And John, perhaps also share the profile of these refugees because, I
These
know
are
usually.
lawyers, these are
Yeah,
doctors, these are college professors. This is the intelligentsia of a country now exiled into this desert village and doing everything they can every day to make sure that their children, even in spite of the circumstances they live in,
yeah,
have an education so that they can uplift themselves when the circumstances change. There's a tent that is just the, the schoolroom, and where the parents sit with their children every day in the classroom and teach them and educate them. That the hope, by the way, signaled in that this is not a
yeah,
community of despair. This is a
yeah,
community believing that their circumstances are going to change and that their children are going to have a better life, and they want to prepare them for that. And one of the things that happened on our behalf is Wafa, and we send some of our mission dollars there, and we send mission personnel there. And I had the opportunity over 2 consecutive years to go visit the village. I have a picture of me holding a little child who was just months old on my first visit, and going back and finding him the second year and holding him again and taking another picture with him, and his mom just beaming. But Wafa went on our behalf and sat down in one of the tents with just the women of the village.
yeah,
And speaking woman to woman to them, she said, "What is it you're not getting that you need?" And they began to talk about things like birth control and feminine hygiene products and things that churches aren't comfortable with or aren't willing to talk about, and certainly not willing to fund support for. But
yeah,
Wafa knew that the United Church of Christ would not have an issue with that. And so it was with a great deal of pride that I
yeah,
listened to a translator articulate her gratitude to the United Church of Christ for providing the women of that village what they needed. And here I am living comfortably in Cleveland, Ohio, listening to a woman at a village a kilometer from the Syrian border in the desert, living in a tent, thank me for taking care of her.
yeah. Well, that's a remarkable story, John. And you also alluded to an NGO in Jordan. Which non-profit, non-government organization is it you work with in Jordan?
I don't remember the name of it offhand. I'll have to get
Don't
that.
worry. Don't worry. You can send that through to us. I'm also intrigued to know to what extent is the King of Jordan involved,
Yes.
and
So I've
his
actually
wonderful wife as well.
on that trip we met with one of the princes, and I got to tell you, listening to him talk about how proud they are as a country and as the governing body, the prince representing the voice of the king, to care for the poor refugees in their midst, knowing that they have very little, that deep sense of hospitality, the deep sense of obligation to care for the stranger in your midst, that the willingness to sacrifice in order to provide for others was deeply moving to me. And then about a year ago, I had an opportunity to meet face to face with the King of Jordan. And I remember the day before, I met him in New York. And the day before I flew to New York, I was visiting with my grandchildren in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I was telling my son what was about to happen. And he said, "Oh, our neighbors across the street are from Jordan." I said, "They are." So I
Yeah.
went over and I knocked on the door. And mom and dad speak very broken English, but their son was there who speaks English. And I told him what I was about to do.
Yeah.
He said, "We are so proud of our king and our government." And he cited two things. One, their care for the refugees. Now, this is a young man, himself now a refugee, living in Chicago, speaking with great pride about how their king takes care of the refugees. And the second is the religious tolerance of that largely Muslim country, and about how the king allows for other expressions of religious faith to thrive in their midst. Those are the two things he was proud of. And the next day I was with the king, and I was one of a few others religious leaders from around the country, so it wasn't one-on-one. But I talked to him about that trip to the desert and how proud I was of their country for taking care of the refugees. You should have seen his face light up. And he couldn't
Really.
stop
And did you
talking
share with
about it.
him? Did you share with him what the young man in Chicago had said
I
about
did.
Muslims?
I
You did?
did. I told
Yeah.
him that, and he was so proud.
Yeah.
And he couldn't stop talking about their obligation to care for the poor and the stranger among them. And
Yeah.
though he's not a Christian, that is straight out of the Christian and Hebrew texts. That moral obligation to care for the stranger in your midst.
Yeah. And so, John, that's such that evokes such a pressing question I've personally had for some time. To what extent can we build bridges? And you have already done this, but build these bridges across different faiths and religions, and perhaps look at, instead of a particular religion as providing the blueprint, if you like, or the specified blueprint of that religion, look at the spiritual laws of the universe.
So I believe, whether I would call this the spiritual law of the universe, I want to play with that notion, but I believe there is something quite natural to the development of the spiritual universe and the human community within it to build connections. I think that's what we're wired for. I
Mm.
think we have to be conditioned otherwise. Um, and
In
Karen
what
Arms, what's that?
in what way? When you say conditioned otherwise, in what way?
So the crass term for this is brainwashing, but it's the
Hmm.
indoctrination of religious and or legal beliefs that whatever identity you want to claim legitimizes, if not requires you to see others as inferior.
Mm.
Good, perhaps, but inferior too. We can do this with race. We can do this
Yeah.
with gender. We can
Yeah.
do this with physical abilities. We
Yeah.
can certainly do this with creedal articulations, but it has to be taught. I don't think we're wired that way. We have to be indoctrinated to think that way.
Yes.
And I think it's born of fear that
Yeah.
that those who orient in the world with the fundamental belief that others are out to get them and are conditioned to respond to fear are always going to utilize, whether it's religion, whether it's gender, whether it's the color of your skin, any of that, utilize their identity as a way of securing themselves against the fear of other. An interesting thing about fear as an emotive response in the
Yeah.
brain's evolutionary development, The first part of the brain to develop was the amygdala. That's what recognizes fear. And we can all understand living in a world where knowing fear meant survival. If you
Yeah.
couldn't detect the lion that was in your pathway, right?
Yeah.
And if the brain didn't have a mechanism to override higher thinking and just produce that fight or flight response, you weren't going to survive. So when that lion attacks, you can't go down a laundry list of 8 opportunities and start categorizing them by the most likely to succeed and slowly eliminate. I mean, you've got to make a decision right there. And so that early primitive brain overrides higher thinking. And I've
Yeah.
discovered that when people are either motivated by fear or taught to fear, the art of rational articulation to a better idea has no use or purpose or function. You must first lower the fear to get there. And it's
Yes.
been my experience that the only antidote to fear is love. That the only thing that can get me once I fear you to stop fearing you is to see something in you, to make that bridge, to make that connection, that
Yeah.
pathway that engenders love. That's the role, I think, of religion. And religion is wrongfully being used now to engender fear, into indoctrinate a feeling of hatred, judgment, condemnation, and superiority towards the other, and
Yes.
using religion as the pathway to that. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's religion. I think that's something else entirely. And love is an articulation of faith. Love is an articulation of human compassion and kindness, is that which can build the bridge that fear destroys. And I've seen this. I've seen
Mm.
the most raging homophobe. I've seen the most strident bigot develop a relationship with somebody that they had previously othered. And once the heart feels that, it really is hard for their fear and condemnation and judgment of that person to return.
That's very powerful, John, and provides remarkable insights and anecdotes around a way forward and thinking about forward. In your mind, what do you think is bold leadership, and where and what do you think are the biggest current threats that we face as a
Yeah,
humanity in terms of the future of leadership?
I think just real quickly, and I'll dwell up more on this in a second, that the 2
Yeah.
things I fear the most are fundamentalism in any articulation. The belief that my set of beliefs and values and religious understandings are fundamentally true and no other can be accepted.
Yeah.
The willingness to set your sights on that which you believe in and close your eyes to all others, and not only close your eyes, force others to close their eyes to anything else. Fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And the second is this rising tide of fascism that we see around the world, whether we're
Yeah.
talking about Orban, whether we're talking about Kim Jong Un, whether we're talking about Vladimir Putin, whether we're talking about Donald Trump. There is a rising tide of fascism that is being fed by an internet that now connects us, but that separates us with algorithms that can identify even the slightest tendency towards that fascism and feed it to us constantly. And
Yeah.
those are the 2 things I fear the most. In terms of movements that I see that are built to sustain the human community. And you asked me to reflect on a moment where Nelson Mandela had an
Yeah.
impact on my life. And I want to say a word about what I saw him do. And then one more, if you don't mind, personal anecdote where I saw what he envisioned actually in work in a tangible, substantial, powerful way.
Yeah.
Following Nelson Mandela, his rise to power, being released from prison,
Yeah.
and then being elected to serve the government that had imprisoned him unjustly,
Hmm.
create the Truth and Reconciliation Task Force,
Yeah.
knowing that the unfolding of the untold history, as painful as it was, as wounding as it was the only pathway towards healing a nation, was a brilliant and inspirational insight. And it took courage, and it took wisdom, and it took an amount of self-sacrifice that I can't even imagine. And it was his gift, not just to the people of South Africa, but it was his gift to humanity. It
Yeah.
was the articulation of a pathway forward. And it matters to me because here in the US context, white
Yeah.
America is scared to death to open up the history books to 400 years of enslavement and genocide that we refuse to tell the full truth about.
Yeah.
And for fear that now we're not only going to lose our power, but the moment that justice gets enacted upon us for this evil, we can't even imagine the horrors that will be done to us. And this articulation of truth and reconciliation as the pathway to the mutual rebuilding of human community is, I think, a gift to the world. I was in Colombia working again with a number of human rights organizations that we partner with around the world. At the end of a 52-year civil war, the longest extended such civil war anywhere on earth, we were there within months of a peace accord being signed between the FARC rebels and the Colombian government. The United Nations had forces in Colombia to hold the peace. And I walked into a village in the Andes that we drove an hour through the mountains and the jungles to get to, a remote village in Grenada.
Yeah.
We found ourselves in a museum memorializing the dead in that town. And the victims were victims of 4 or 5 different warring factions there in the country. There wasn't an enemy, there was a multiplicity of enemies. And 2 things happened that were utterly unscripted.
Yeah.
We found ourselves being followed by a gentleman who didn't speak a word. And neither we who were there touring the museum nor the museum's curators who were telling us the story of the deceased families knew who this person was. Somebody finally stopped and asked him.
Yeah.
Well, this was a FARC rebel. This was one of the insurgents against the Colombian government. And he had spent about 2.5, 3 years in prison because in a part of the peace process was the articulation of their own Truth and Reconciliation Project. And the deal was that the peace agreement as signed offered this, that any soldier who came forward and confessed their war crimes would spend a small amount of time in jail, but
Yeah.
then would be released to community service to do good in the communities they had harmed. This gentleman began to tell his story about how he was kidnapped at the age of 11 by the FARC rebels,
Yeah.
tied to a tree where he was almost starved to death for like weeks, released and then indoctrinated slash brainwashed to become a soldier for the FARC rebel army.
Yeah.
Tells the story of his mother spending years looking for him and eventually finding him because she heard rumor about a FARC battalion coming through their village, and she went out to meet them and found her son, knelt in
Wow.
the street in front of him, weeping and begging him to come back. But he was so indoctrinated that he simply slapped his mother and continued walking down the street and abandoned her.
Sure.
In that town of Grenada, where in that museum were memorialized about 100 victims who were killed by a bomb set off by the FARC rebels in town. It was in a truck. It was a truck bomb. It exploded. About 100 people died.
Yeah.
This soldier confessed his complicity in those war crimes, had just been released from jail, and told his story to us of him being kidnapped, of him being indoctrinated and then spending his adult years as a war criminal, confessing his crimes. And we left the museum and went from there to a group that were working on a road extending the paved road from the village up further into the mountains where families lived but had no access to the village. And it was a paved road, but about every 10 feet in the paved road was a memorial stone. And the
Yeah.
memorial stone commemorated one of the dead. And working side by side, building that road, were both uh, uh, citizens in the village
Yeah.
and these FARC rebels who had confessed their war crimes and were now doing community service, working side by side, literally building a bridge to a better way.
Yeah.
That's
That's really,
that's what Nelson Mandela has done.
yeah.
And this combination of telling the truth out loud and openly, and this
Yeah.
movement in America to end education about our racial history is a scourge and will only deepen the wounds that it has created. What
That's
Nelson
really,
Mandela has done to articulate the call to speak the truth, to, to pay to pay for the crimes you committed,
yeah.
but then to receive compassion, kindness, grace, and forgiveness, and to stand side by side with those whose your crimes violated in the construction of a new pathway to a better future is something that I believe in, and I think is Nelson Mandela's greatest gift to the world.
And to that end, John, do you think that that is relevant and has its place in the world today? I mean, I'm kind of almost
Absolutely.
hearing it is, but the extent to which that can be shared with the world to help us find a better way for all.
I think it's essential. It is a pathway articulated through the primacy of love and compassion and not through the primacy of fear and hatred.
Yeah.
And if if we can't get off of this pathway of fear and hatred, we are going to destroy ourselves. It's that
Yeah.
simple.
Well, that's why we need more champions of change like yourself, John,
Oh, you're
and
very kind. Thank you.
there are many others that are part of this movement worldwide who truly care about that pathway and believe in this interconnectedness of humanity and how when we join forces, we do create these pathways that are better for everyone. So
Yeah.
I'll move. Thank you for sharing those. Just moving to a couple of fun facts about you.
Okay.
I know that, I'm curious to know what is the Corinthian verse you read? What is, can you, can you share that verse with us that, or the essence of that verse that captured the heart of Mimi?
Sure. This was at my brother's wedding,
Yeah,
and I won't capture it all, but it begins: "Love is patient, love is kind, love is not boastful, love does not put on airs, love does not delight in wrong." And it ends with that oft heard phrase: "Faith, hope, and love abide, but the greatest of these is love."
that's beautiful. That I can understand why you captured
Yeah.
her heart at that moment. And you gave up soccer. What was it? What was it about soccer? And have you played soccer
Oh,
since?
I have my knees and ankles have not, but I still play, but
Yeah,
not the competitive kind that I played growing up. I I don't know why, but when I was a child, soccer, I fell in love with it. I was playing organized competitive soccer when I was 5 years old, and when I was a child, I had a ball and I would be in my backyard, and even if I couldn't find anybody, by for hours, I and that ball were one, and I'd dribble around and I'd juggle it and I'd
yeah,
kick it against the fence and imagine myself competing in the World Cup. And I would spend my Sunday mornings watching replays and highlights from the Bundesliga games in Germany.
Yeah.
Um, and I had the good fortune during my high school years of being recruited by the former both goalkeeper for the Brazilian national team, and then he coached the Brazilian national team. He played on the teams, the World Cup teams that Pele played on.
Oh,
And he was
fantastic.
living
Wow.
in St. Louis, and he was
Yeah.
officiating games and saw me play and pulled me aside and gave me some one-on-one coaching. And he was a coach at St. Louis University at the time. They were the number one ranked team in the country. It was he that extended me the scholarship. Um, and I never, when I walked onto a field, I never cared if I won or lost. Just the art of competitive engagement with others. All I wanted was for the game never to end. I wanted to just, I was, even if we won, when the whistle blew to end the game, it was like a moment of sadness for me. Can't we all just
Really?
agree to keep playing? This is the most fun we're ever going to have together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was where I found my joy. I sometimes had a rough childhood, but moments like that were just complete and utter joy for me.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
taken joy in coaching my younger brother, coaching my son, now my grandson,
Oh,
and
what
watching them
fun.
enjoy the sport.
What fun. And the third question I have is, what do you think each of your parents would say about you in terms of the thing they most admired, respected, and loved about you?
So thank you for that. My dad is died 7 years ago,
I'm sorry.
and he used to say over and over and over again, "All you have is your name." And it was his way of saying, make decisions and live your life in such a way that when your name is spoken, you bring pride and honor to the household and the family. And he would say, you spend your whole life doing that, and one act will change it all. And I think what he would be most proud of, and I said this at his funeral, that our
Yeah.
dad said, all we have is our name. I think what he would be most proud of is that I have not done that one thing that would bring shame upon the family, but I
Yeah.
lived a life that brought honor and dignity and respect to the household. That would be what he's most proud of. My mom would be most proud that at every step along the way, I did what made me happy. Mom was never more happy than when her children were happy. And she was never more distraught than when conditions were such that we could not find our happiness. And my mom is still living. Um,
Yes.
and I think what would make her most proud is that every step of the way, I opted for those things that made me happy. And so when my spiritual director and my best friends and elders were saying, John, this makes no sense,
Yeah.
went in the direction that made my heart happy. And mom would be most proud of that. What a great
Wow.
question.
Well, what incredible parents to have inspired that, living up to a great name and living up to what makes you happy. And it's certainly, listening to you, John, has kind of shaped your path. I can hear that in the work that you do. And in our final few moments together, what do you think, what would you say to our generation and the next around the future of leadership? And what do you think Mandela would say to the world today?
To the first question, center joy. That would be what I would say to leaders anywhere. I am very aware that because I am a leader and because I run an organization with literally 117 employees, that power can make others feel wary of you and feel nervous and anxious around you. And I remember something that Thich Nhat Hanh once said. He said, sometimes my joy is the source of my smile. At other times, my smile is the source of my joy. And that's his way of saying you can choose to be happy.
Yes.
And so, and uh, by finding joy, articulating joy, what I mean by that is bring that smile with you everywhere. As a leader, there are people who will fear you and be anxious in your presence. The mere
Yeah.
casting of a smile can lighten the mood, release the anxiety, and help them let go of the fear. And if your smile brings them a smile, the extension of joy is maybe the simplest and the greatest gift that we can offer. And as far as what Nelson Mandela would say, um, I'm going to go back to what I talked about,
Yeah.
that, that grace should always triumph over retribution. Now, I'm very aware that I'm saying that from the most privileged position on the planet, a white American heterosexual male, right?
Yeah.
So it can very easily come across as ignore my sins and crimes and just be gracious and kind to me and forgive me. But I really want to say that from what I believe to be the heart of Nelson Mandela, who had every right to orient his life in leadership around revenge, but chose a pathway to grace, forgiveness, and reconciliation in
Yeah.
order not just to heal wounds, but to open up pathways to mutuality that would not have been possible otherwise. And I think he would remind us of the powerful force that is grace and forgiveness.
Yeah.
And if you have time for just one
Of
small
course.
anecdote, that gentleman that I talked about in that museum,
Yes. In Colombia.
there was a point at which one of the warring factions had learned about his actions as a soldier, and in order to get retribution, went back to his home village and kidnapped his sister, got his
Wow.
sister on the phone, and called him and said, the sister begged him to come home. She was setting a trap for this individual that had kidnapped her. They wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
Um, and when he wouldn't, while on the phone, that soldier shot and killed his sister.
Oh my
And he
word.
swore that day that before he died, he would avenge the death of his sister. Something happened to him in prison. He found faith, whatever pathway to faith that was, doesn't matter. He found faith and he felt called to forgive. While he was in prison, he met the man that kidnapped and killed his sister. And when the
Wow.
man saw him, he stood before him in utter fear because he knew that he was about to be avenged. And what happened instead was that soldier forgave him. He forgave him. This man told his story. I was in tears weeping.
Yeah.
I think that would be Nelson's word to the world, that there is a pathway through grace and forgiveness and reconciliation that vengeance could never find.
John, on that incredibly poignant, powerful, resonant note, thank you for your gracious gift to the world, for building bridges, for finding pathways, for being part of this transformational process and movement for change. And I'm so excited for us to be doing more together. Thank you for your goodness and your grace and your love.
You're welcome. And thank you for bringing the world together for these conversations.
Nelson Mandela once said that religion is a private conversation between an individual and their chosen higher power. His religious leaders and friends referred to him as a closet Christian, a man of faith who was very private and careful to ensure that his personal beliefs did not alienate nor divide. A man who was bigger than any one denomination in his quest for reconciliation to ensure that he could unify across multiple religions and non-believers too. I recall personally the day Mandela died and the week that followed. Every day, as the heavens opened and the rains came down, different religious leaders and traditional leaders paid tribute to his glorious life at the Nelson Mandela Foundation and beyond. The chief rabbi, the Anglican bishop, the Catholic pope, the head of the Methodist Church, traditional leaders, and many more. Listening today to the former global president of United Church of Christ, Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, helps us reflect upon the changing role of the church. How do we unify across the churches? What religion is? What spirituality is? And how do we align the two? His answers are reflected in simple yet profound loving actions, his spiritual capacity to connect with something much bigger than himself, his religious capacity to bring kindness and compassion to those in need and beyond his Christian denomination. As global president of United Church of Christ, John worked with the Greek Orthodox Church in Jordan to help 2.5 million Muslim refugees from Syria. His work actively extends beyond a single denomination to bring love, peace, and justice to those in dire need. In John's own words, he is a theological minimalist. For those of you who believe in God or a different higher power, he believes that two things matter, that God or our higher power is love, and our higher power is just. He continues that love without justice is merely sentimental, and justice without love is merely self-righteous anger. But together, with love and justice combined, we can change the world. It made me reflect upon the current heartbreaking conflict in Israel and Gaza today. What if we unified across national borders and different religions and denominations to bring peace, love, and justice to the Israeli hostages, to the Israeli people, and to the ordinary citizens of Gaza and Palestine in an equally loving and compassionate way? To unify, we must be bigger than any one denomination of believers and non-believers too. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. Take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.